Hey everyone, welcome back to You Are What You Love. I am your host, Marissa Tandon, and today we have the first ever dual guest episode of You Are What You Love. I am very excited to have some podcasting pals on the show to talk about a very relevant, influential children's book series. Though we'll get into whether or not it's really for kids or for everyone as we go along. Erica and Carter are the co-hosts of the Percy Jackson podcast, Seaweed Brain, which I am a big fan of and really enjoy listening to. So I am very excited to have them on to help me celebrate that next week the Chalice of the Gods comes out and Percy Jackson is back. So please welcome Erica and Carter to the podcast.
Hello. Oh my gosh, it's actually September 1st when we're recording this, but the fact that it comes out this month is a little overwhelming.
Yeah.
I am truly overwhelmed by it. I can't believe it actually because it's kind of exciting. I think there's like a renaissance of people returning to it because there's a new book coming out, and it's very exciting to me to just like have Rick doing press again, talking about the book, bringing a new chapter of the story out.
I'm excited to have some of our guests who we haven't had on since the original series come back because they were like, oh, I haven't read Heroes of Olympus, or oh, I haven't read Trials of Apollo, or they, aren't up to date on like The Sun and the Star. But I was like, hey, there's like a under 300 page, I actually don't know off the top of my head how many pages it is, but there's like a relatively short original cast book coming out. Do you want to read it and come back on the show? And they're like, yeah, that sounds amazing.
My fun summer thing that happened was The Sun and the Stars. I was in Palm Springs and I went to a tiny local bookstore there. And I think it was actually called the Best Bookstore in Palm Springs, if I'm remembering, because it's the only local indie bookstore in Palm Springs. So it's one of those cute ones. And I walked in and they had 7 signed copies of The Sun and the Stars. And I was like, hello? Like, so I have my little signed copy from Rick. Which is great. Well, I'm excited about this episode because we've never had 2 people come on at the same time. Partially because that sounds really difficult, but also partially because we've never had a reason to talk about like the connection between 2 people that a piece of media can have, and this is like a perfect opportunity to do that. So I am curious about the 2 of your relationships. Like, how did you guys meet in the first place?
Oh, Carter, do you want to go first?
Sure, I can kick us off. So Erica and I were in the same 6th grade class.
We mean like class. Like there were like probably 250 kids in our grade level, but we were in the same class.
25-person class. Erica just switched over to the school that we were at, and there were a lot of like intense class bonding activities, including a camp that Erica still has like a Facebook photo album for that was like several days. We had some overlapping interests. We got to school early when there were not that many people there yet and would like talk about music and TV and stuff. I hesitate to get into too much beyond that at the risk of embarrassing ourselves.
Lady Gaga definitely had involvement, as did Ryan Murphy's early productions.
Schwartz probably at that point in our lives,
Oh my goodness. The classics.
Yeah. Anyway, we bonded over those things. At that point, we would have been like between iterations of the book series, right? This would have been after the first 5 books had come out, which we would have read independently, and like before the Heroes of Olympus had been completed. The other like maybe foundational piece of our like early childhood lore with the books is that I spoiled the House of Hades for Erica at our school in the library very enthusiastically. And it was like a foundational moment, a foundational trauma perhaps in our relationship that is kind of the crux for the podcast that we have done.
It's really funny because you used to be so much more annoying. I feel like you really like cooled it, Like you said, like you were a little, not gonna curse, but like you were an annoying 14-year-old.
Impish, pretentious.
Impish and pretentious. Now we're like a little bit, I think we're just like exhausted and pretentious now.
So I'm hearing it was like love at first sight. There were no problems and everything just worked.
In our friendship?
Well. Yeah.
Well,
I don't really think we've ever fought. I think that we benefit from being in like a small part of like a 12-person friend group.
There were, do you remember this? There was like a period of time in 8th grade where everyone had a lot of anxiety about moving to high school and, who was going to still be friends with who, because people were taking maybe different classes and people would have to physically hang out at different places. Where we like at lunch,
we were going to be in different math tracks.
Like barely different math tracks, but like literally we would not be in the same classroom together anymore. And so we like were in at like lunch 3 or 4 days in a row. We'd like all gone to a room and like screamed at each other all of our different anxieties about this transition period. But we weren't like not friends,
We would get into it. We would have two classrooms that were joined together by like a small office
like
room,
printer room
that would have like the printer. Yeah, it was like a little printer room. And we would lock ourselves inside of the printer room, which like has the illusion of being like a soundproof small cave. And that's where we would gather during breaks and just scream at each other.
I love that. So you guys both discovered the Percy Jackson series, the original series, separately before you became friends.
Yes.
Do you both remember what your first experience was with the books, how you found them?
I read them in 5th grade very specifically. I know because I have all of the books in paperback except for The Last Olympian is the hardcover because I got it when it came out. And our entire class was reading them together because we, at this time, maybe it started in 4th grade and continued to 5th grade. I think one of our assistant teachers just like really liked them and wanted us to read them. So we all got into reading them together. But we were also like, I don't remember how this worked in conjunction with the Harry Potter Club that I had started at the time, but there was something about our very Presbyterian elementary school was a lot more comfortable with us reading Percy Jackson than Harry Potter because Greek mythology was a lot more on limits than like satanic witchcraft.
Totally. Yeah. I can see the difference.
Which I thought I had kind of like vaguely made up. But in doing our podcast, I've learned as a circumstance for a lot of kids who went to like religious elementary schools or had like religious upbringings that they were allowed to read Percy Jackson where they weren't allowed to read other things.
Yeah, I think that was true for me. My elementary school, before I moved to LA, the Harry Potter books were banned in the libraries, but the Percy Jackson books were fine.
Oh.
Yeah.
And so we're like the Spiderwick Chronicles, and so it's like it was a very odd mix, I think, of what was allowed.
Were they right all along? Was that like a case of book banning being like kind of slayful?
Yeah, maybe they knew. They were like, we can feel the hatred. We can feel the hatred coming out of these pages. You shouldn't read these. Yeah, I think that's interesting. It's a weirdly universal experience that the Harry Potter books were banned. I wonder if it's just because it's like to some degree they seem a little more academic, like they're based on mythology and it's being said that it's mythology and there's a history level to it. I don't know.
It's because of the one line when Chiron says, "We don't talk about capital G God." That's a whole other thing.
That's allowed. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Carter, for you, when did you discover the Percy Jackson books?
I would have read them in elementary school, and I have paperback up through, which is hardcover, and I got right when it came out, read on like this very formative family trip on like all of these little bus rides when I was supposed to be like learning about other places and looking at scenery and stuff. It's like a worn out hardcover copy. I like lugged it around another country with me for like 2 weeks. But yeah, I don't know. I had a strong relationship with them. I was definitely an elementary school child who like reread those books in my own copies like enough times that my copy of The Lightning Thief doesn't like work anymore. The spine is gone.
Did you both have like a moment in the books that made you go, oh yeah, this is it. This is my thing?
I have like literally no memories from childhood sometimes. I think like I can barely remember reading these books for the first time, but I do have a very specific memory of my mom. Like we used to have dinner at my grandparents' house once a week, and my mom would like tote me around and like make me like perform something. This was before I started acting, but I would like memorize commercials as a kid, you know, and she'd be like, do the McDonald's Filet-O-Fish commercial for everyone. Or like I would recite Ryan Higa YouTube videos, you know, be like, Sham, woohoo.
Wow, that was a throwback.
Yeah. But one thing I remember my mom was like, Erica knows all of the Greek gods. Go ahead and list them and what they stand for, Erica. And I would like stand up and I would be like, okay. So I remember doing that, which means that I definitely got it. I think I got into them for like the nerdy, like gods are super cool. Ocean powers are super cool vibe.
Similar for you, Carter? Like it was very much the cool factor?
Well, it bridged that good middle divide between me like spending a large part of, I want to say second grade in the 200s of the Dewey Decimal System section of my like elementary school library, which was all the different, you know, like world pantheons. That was, I feel like I get the sense that it is common for like small gay children to develop like weird, strong obsessions with things that they can categorize and kind of wrap their heads around completely so that you can say that you have like a full contained knowledge of a thing, that you conquered some intellectual world, right?
Yeah.
So that would be me. I would be going through all the different, like trying to memorize all the different like Mayan gods and the different Aztec gods and the different Chinese, you know, like and so on and so forth through that section. And so when I first read the books, I was like, this is such an interesting place between that and Harry Potter, which I'd reread like 3 or 4 times maybe by that point. But I distinctly remember as a child being like, like I'm a little uncomfortable because the versions are a little bit different than some of the Greek myths that I read the Dowlayers books first, and I was like, this is not exactly the same version. What an instructive formative experience for me as a child to be like, you can't actually, consolidate all knowledge of a culture into a single uniform thing. But then also being like, wow, these are like funnier. They're funnier, and I feel like I know people so much more as opposed to like, this is going to sound like revisionist history, but I do remember having a strong reaction as an elementary school student to the Titan's Curse and being like, these are portraits of people who are interesting and funny.
Yeah.
And that is new for me because I reread the Harry Potter books a number of times.
Yeah. I want to add also the funny thing. I think I just thought Percy was so relatable. He was just so, I want to say, like, and then maybe this is revisionist history and like me fantasizing about my younger self, but I really think that I recognize like petty sees petty, and Percy sassy was always present, and I was a very impish, like sassy, tantrum throwing kid who was like not cool, but was already, like had weird glasses and wore jean shorts. And so I was developing a sense of humor to compensate for the fact that I wasn't very pretty from a young age. And so I really loved, and like, I feel like I related with Percy as a narrator.
Yeah, it's interesting that you are both using the term like revisionist history or like feeling as though you're changing what struck you as you look back on it. Because I think in talking about these books lately, I've realized that I do think, yeah, you can look back on it and be like, oh, this is what it was. But I think that feeling was still there. Like you may not have necessarily been able to put words to the fact that, oh, I'm sarcastic and funny because I'm compensating for this or that. But looking back now, you can say like, oh, well, absolutely, that's the thing that was striking me about it, because I have a little bit more self-awareness from that. So I think it's like, it's not necessarily revisionist, it's just that you have the distance to be able to say like, this is definitely what it was.
Yeah, I guess so. That's very generous of you.
I guess I was just thinking about it because like for me, I've been thinking about the books a lot and being like, oh, like what was it that got me? And I think it was the first like chosen one narrative or like young adult narrative that's focused on a single parent narrative versus like an orphan narrative. And I was raised by a single dad. So it was like a little bit of being able to have that. I think so many people in that age group in that time were like waiting for their letter from Hogwarts because everybody sort of fit it. But I don't remember any of my friends being like, oh, I'm waiting for my godly parent to claim me. They were sort of just like, whatever. And I was like, oh, well, this is a fun escapist thing. I could find out that I have a cool godly mom instead,
Oh, that's so special.
Yeah, very, very like, I think Rick in those books, especially for the time period, was like one of the first in that age group that was starting to represent stuff that wasn't being represented both in like mental health and family dynamics, in character dynamics. I don't know. Like you said, you had this moment of recognizing that there were clear, interesting characters that had something to say that you weren't getting from the rest of your books in that age group. I actually just realized normally at the beginning of these episodes, I ask if you were trying to describe Percy Jackson to someone who had never read Percy Jackson, what would you say? And I totally skipped that question because I assumed everyone should know they're the best books ever. So as I say that though, there's probably someone listening right now that is like, I have no clue what they're talking about. So if you were describing Percy Jackson in like 30 seconds to someone who had no idea what they are, tell me what the Percy Jackson books are about.
Greek mythology meets tween rage that is trying to tear down while at the same time working within a system of particularly American capitalism for 8-year-olds.
That was so succinct and true. I loved that. Did you, either of you, like look at those books and discuss them? Like, were they the types of books that you were telling your parents about or talking to your friends before you met each other about? I know, Erica, you mentioned you were reading them in class. Were you like having semi-intellectual discussions about these in the 5th grade?
I would say yes. I have never been able to, A, be into something normally, or B, like not talk about the media that I'm like, I've never ever had that relationship with media. I've always wanted to talk about it, or like always gotten like aggressively into it. High School Musical was an early thing for sure. Had a High School Musical themed birthday party. Starting the Harry Potter Club was a big thing. Doing like themed parties, making butterbeer, that whole thing. And then, yeah, we definitely discussed at great length. Like we were basically book clubbing. Like not everybody in the class was reading Percy Jackson. It wasn't like an assignment. It was like this cool, fun side thing we were doing. And then we would talk about them at length in high school when Heroes of Olympus happened.
Same for you, Carter, like similar?
Yeah, I definitely talked about it with some classmates. I'm trying to think about the discussions I would have had. Maybe they were mostly with my sister. I do remember talking a lot about the books, and we definitely like traded those copies back and forth. Although at the time, like, I would have been like years old, and then so she would have been like young, like 6. Um,
So very much reading above her age group. That's amazing.
yeah, I'm like, did that happen? But I believe that it did. Like, I think so. Yeah, there were definitely used probably words like capitalism or had discussions about character development or things that are more, formal in nature. But I definitely remember there were a lot of like classroom conversations about like what people should be reading. And people tried to give good substantive answers to those questions. And for Percy Jackson, there was a lot like people would say things that were like pretty formal things about it. Like a lot of people talked a lot about the first person narration as being something that sets us apart and was a reason why you should like pick this book over famously is something like Harry Potter that doesn't have the same level of like voice from a child in it.
It's interesting that you bring up the first person narration of the book because I think from like literary discussion, a lot of times first person narration gets looked down on as like a lower type of writing than third or second even, which is like very intense to read. But when you're talking about like first person narration, a lot of times that's like associated with either children's book, young adult books, or romance novels, all of which are sort of looked down on as not real literature, so to speak. But we've already talked about a number of things in this book, these books that are quite like worth analyzation, are worth like kind of discussion in general. And I'm curious if you guys think the first person narration is part of what makes it so accessible versus reading something like, not to continue to pick on it, but Harry Potter is in third. It doesn't have you like, excited to feel connected to Harry and his journey.
I am in general a huge first person narration proponent. Like, unless you are literally Virginia Woolf, I don't.
That's what I was gonna say.
Like, if you cannot like prove to me through the beauty of your like multi-consciousness prose that you have earned a third person narration, I want to like meet a person. I want to experience interiority. And to me, like that is part of what is great about a novel. There are a lot of books where unless you have really, really excellent third person narration, I feel as the reader that the specific value I'm getting out of the form of the book as opposed to say a television adaptation or a movie or something is far less because we're not getting like I want to have this deep creative empathetic experience with another person's perspective. And I think that you just get that at such a greater level with the first person narration. Percy's voice is so specific and distinct and rich, and I think taps into something that a lot of children are dealing with, which is that like stage one coming of age, realizing that authority figures are not perfect and that people have more power than you and are using that power to make your life harder and trying to process that. I think that that's like really profound. And you can't like, are you going to narrate that experience better with like some godly voice saying, this is right, this is wrong? No, you're not. You want to see the way that somebody talks through and feels through that experience so that you can look at that and say, I identify with that in some ways. I don't identify with that in other ways. And that is how I learn more about what I'm going through and what other people are going through. I don't know. Yeah, it's not, I think the genres that you highlight are important, but there are so many other, like a lot of memoirs, a lot of like works that are considered groundbreaking in terms of like ethnic literature, queer literature, all things that are these first person perspective journeys. And it's the same idea behind that denigration that also denigrates qualitative work, that denigrates, like other ways of knowing. When like for so many situations, like the way that you know something and feel something and access something is through an experience, especially in the absence of something larger and authoritative and universal and coming down from a central source of power that is meant to consolidate experiences into like a quantitative data set or something broader. I don't know. This is not a perfect analogy, but it's something that I think does exist in the way that people talk about different forms of writing and knowing.
Yeah. No, I think that was like the most passionate and correct explanation for why first person is so powerful. I followed you all the way through.
Voice is important. I was just Googling when you asked that, like my favorite writer and the only other Caucasian male writer I've ever willingly read in my entire life besides Rick Riordan, Kurt Vonnegut, is a user of first person. Often when he is writing as Kurt Vonnegut in his own stories, like the fictional version of himself will be a first person perspective. I think he does that in Slaughterhouse-Five. But I think voice is what, like you said, Carter, not only what makes things interesting, but it's just an honest way to interact with a story. And a lot of what I read now in my thinking about the connection between Percy Jackson as a kid, a lot of what I read now as an adult is like personal essay collections. I think very specifically, I have a friend who was editing something for me one time. I think it was like a film review. And she was like, this is very voicey. Like, I get what you're trying to do here. Like, you're being very voicey and like you have a voice, but like, I think it's kind of like ridiculous. And I was like, oh, am I being voicey? That's so embarrassing.
I think that's so true, though, is it's like if you're reading a book, it's because you want to connect and you want to feel like a personal experience. And there is an inherent distance in third person narration versus first.
Yeah, I think the personal and like maybe it's like very zillennial of us to just be like the way we interact with the world is like inherently connected to our identities. And like you cannot separate your identities even when you're like telling a fictional story.
Well, I mean, okay, I think that's it. But it's not even just literally in the sense of like identities that you can box up. It's just the idea of subjectivity, right? That like everyone, even if you could quantize two people as being the same in the way that you would describe them, they would narrate the story differently. And the narration is like part of the experience. It's part of how they create meaning. It's part of how they create facts. Like, not to be too whatever, like postmodern up in here, but I just feel like it's a form of honesty to say like this is how I'm understanding this and creating this story. We talk on our podcast all the time about how Percy Jackson and Annabeth are the greatest story ever told. And that's a very deliberate frame because we're not saying it's like the greatest example of love necessarily. It is a story that is told. And that's really important, I think. I don't know if I have even thought about the other question, but I think the first question is the more interesting question because storytelling is everything. And like telling a story in a way that is telling a story, I think has a lot of value to it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think one of the other things that you lose, and then one of the other things that you're kind of talking about and skirting around is like perspective versus voice as well. If you don't have the first person narration, like one of my favorite things to read is an unreliable narrator because that is part of the personality of the book and personality of that character. So like the betrayal of a narrator lying to you because they're lying to themselves, they're lying to an audience, whatever, it's such an extra portion of like the relationship that gets lost in third person. Not that there's not things that have been written in third person that are of value, but actually as you were pointing out all the different genres that use first person, I was like, oh, The Great Gatsby is written in first person. It's not even just like some of the like biggest classics have that deep connection. It just perhaps the genres I pointed out with it are the ones where it gets called a negative thing because there are other aspects being associated to that.
Yeah, people try to act like it's derogatory.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. That's first person forever. I'll never write anything in third person again. Thank you so much.
Quick plug for Thick by Tressie McMillan Cottom. The opening essay in this collection of essays, she uses this metaphor of how she is like bow-legged and pigeon-toed and how her entire life she has had to fix her feet in order to walk in like a visually pleasant way for other people, and that like that doing that has like gradually worn down her hip joint so much that she is like in physical therapy for the rest of her life. But she uses that as a metaphor of being like, I can't not fix my feet wherever I go, and whatever I'm doing and telling and however I'm researching and interacting with my research, I'm always fixing my feet. And you are going to see the work of me fixing my feet in my writing, and you are going to know that I'm fixing my feet, and you're going to know why I have to fix my feet, and that's all important to the work that I'm doing in like my sociology research. Percy is fixing his feet all the time.
Agreed. Yeah, I also I think the other thing that you get, which is something that I wanted to talk about with these books anyways, this is like a perfect transition. The first person narration allows Percy to admit when he does something wrong, to like admit to you, to admit to the reader, to admit to the kids reading these books, like, I did something that wasn't great and maybe you shouldn't do that either.
Real.
Yeah. Do you guys feel like the moral compass of Percy and like his understanding of right and wrong and also messing up was important to your development reading those books?
Hugely. Percy, okay, I think that he is so excellent for starting out being somebody who has a strong sense of what is right and what is unfair, and pointing things out as being unfair, like in large part because his mother has a strong sense of what is right and wrong, and he like trusts that deeply. But we also have an opportunity to progress with him through these things, and I think that we are very strongly pro the Titan's Curse, the third book in the original series, as being an incredible piece of literature and one of the standout books in this series, because basically the entire arc of this book is about Percy having to reevaluate his fundamental idea about what a hero is. And to do that in a way that is so, like, the journey of this book is doing that interrogation in large part through an interrogation of gender and his relationship to the women and girls in his life. This is the book when the hunters show up. This is the book when Annabeth gets abducted and they're going off to try to rescue her.
This is the book that is not his quest. It's not his prophecy that he is given. It's not a quest he's even invited on, and he chooses to go anyway, endangering everybody who has to be on this quest, in addition to his own life as a stupid boy. It's the stupid boy book.
Yes. And also, like, running through this whole book conversation about Hercules, because one of the main characters in this book is somebody who actually like however many thousands of years ago, interacted with Hercules and helped him to complete his quest. And in exchange, he like ruined her life. Percy has to reevaluate his relationship to that and to think about who he's aspiring to be. What are the consequences of his actions? What are unintended harms?
What is masculinity?
When he needs to step back, what is masculinity? What is like power and privilege? And he doesn't use necessarily the word power and privilege. He doesn't say, I need to step back because I'm a boy and the hunters are telling me that because I'm a boy, I'm taking up too much space. But what he does say is some version of like, learn from people who have really different experiences from me. And there are like these histories that I need to constantly think about that are from outside my perspective that will force me to reevaluate what I think is important, what I think is good, how I can help people, and when I need to step back. Because this is all also then tying into the broader, like the arc of the books. If we can spoil the end of book 5 for you, Percy's journey is one that culminates with him deciding to not do something, to trust another person, to step back, to cede power, to yield. And that is like a wild, and at least in our consumption of children's literature at the time, that's a very unconventional story structure. To say that like, you are special because you are somebody who has gone on a journey, who has taught you that you need to sometimes give grace to others and recognize that you don't have the power to fix everything and to know your limits. I just think that that's such a good way to structure children's literature and literature in general, because that is a lesson that you have to relearn constantly and to re-navigate constantly in every situation as your status changes, as your power changes. Like, what do I owe to the people around me? What can I do and what can I not do? That, it's a good text to return to for that reason.
Absolutely.
Something Carter said in the first season of our podcast when we were doing the original books was like, we don't like love Percy Jackson because of its relationship to classics and antiquity. Like, we love Percy Jackson in spite of its relationship to classics and antiquity. And I think that a really key difference between Percy Jackson and the classics is the idea of yielding. That Percy, again, spoiler for The Last Olympian, gives up immortality. Although he is the chosen one, like, he steps back constantly and he's trying to do less. At this point in his life, when we're going to get the Chalice of the Gods, he is trying to do less and trying to just get into college and like step back and focused on what we owe to each other more than his own personal glory after the Titan's Curse.
I am so glad you guys brought up book 3 because I think that book, again, slightly revisionist history, slightly having the adult perspective to look back at the experience now. I do think that book is one of the first ones that I can remember being like, oh, the chosen one doesn't mean that you get to be in charge the whole time. Like, there isn't just one main character in life. There isn't one person who is like everyone has to sacrifice their experience for this person to be the hero of the story.
Yes.
And sometimes being a hero means supporting the people whose turn it is. And I do think that is, I actually, racking my brain for all of the young adult books I've read all of that time, I actually cannot think of another book that ever shifts that dynamic in that way.
I think that the landscape has grown and changed a lot in the subsequent years. But certainly at the time, this was how I think that we probably first would have interfaced with these ideas about a more expansive version of, ethics and responsibility.
Titan's Curse is a masterpiece because the more we talk about it, the more I'm like, oh God, all the threads tie together. Like the fact that that's the book where Talia reappears and is like, well, I could have been the child of the prophecy, but then I was a tree. And that's on you now, buddy. Good luck.
And she still might be. Like, no, for most of the book, we're like, it could be Talia. Her birthday is like the day after the quest ends. And then we get that like twist ending at the end where we're like, no, it's still Percy. But for most of this, like Percy is also like trying to be like, wait, I guess maybe I'm not the child of the prophecy anymore. And but like I still gotta go help Annabeth, right? But
I do kind of remember as a kid revisionist history being like, oh my God, are these books gonna like pivot to this slayful goth girl being the main character for the rest of the series? Like, how cool would that be?
I will say also that was the first time, like this is definitely as an adult going back, I didn't have these feelings as a kid, but I have looked back and said like the first 2 books really deal with like that not like other girls syndrome that girls are forced into, of like the Aphrodite cabin being sort of blown off, like Annabeth fitting in because she's not like the other girls, and that girly nature being demonized. But I think also Titan's Curse is the first time that women start to take the forefront, take the power, and that starts to be corrected again with Rick and his writing in these books as well. And so I think that's also the first book I can remember being like, okay, yeah, like maybe the girls get to be in charge for a second. Maybe the girls get to be the most important part, even though there's a guy over there who has been defined as the guy.
The Percy Jackson series, the Camp Half-Blood Chronicles, if you will, have never been very high-minded about the idea of not being like the other girls. I think that the vast majority of girls are not like the other girls, in quotations. I use that phrase throughout the entirety of the series, all the way up to right now. I actually don't think we've really done enough corrective work. I still think that we are yet to like meet like a female who is like really feminine and unapologetic about it and isn't demonized for it.
Yeah.
I really can't think of a single one. And that's okay if that's, I don't think that's Rick's bag.
Yeah, I would love to see in some of that formative media, and maybe this is like a personal issue with it, because I can definitely point back to, especially in those years, the books that were coming out, all of the like badass female protagonists were also like, ew, pink makeup? I don't think so. And I think like now as an adult, I've recently realized how much of my own femininity or like response to traditionally feminine like expressions of my gender have been influenced by that era of being like, okay, well, you're kind of gonna be the dork who gets to stay at home, or you're just gonna be the love interest, or you're, not going to be powerful if you lean into that femininity.
Yeah.
So I personally would love to see a little bit more correctiveness. I think there's been so little media that has leaned into allowing like that traditionally feminine girl to be the hero of the story in an intense way. But Rick doesn't have to be the one to do it. I just would love to see it fixed.
I think we went through the very, we took our medicine of going from, lack of feminism to the, well, in order to achieve power, we have to emulate masculinity. And now we're finally reaching this point of, what's cool? You know what's in? Hot bimbos. And being a bimbo. And I think that, we're going to get, probably in the next few years, a surge of hot bimbo main characters being well, I'm just, a pretty girl, and things are happening to me. What am I supposed to do about that?
Yeah, give me a hot bimbo with a sword. That's all I'm looking for.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
I love, nowadays, I love Tylee. I love, who's it? Starfire? Is that her name?
Yeah.
She used to irritate the patootie out of me. Now I'm Starfire, the vegan, incredible, bimbo with, magical powers. Yes, more of her.
Do you guys remember the first time you told each other that you loved the Percy Jackson books and started to talk about them together, since you experienced them separately?
Literally no idea. I have no idea.
Literally no. I feel like they were such a ubiquitous cultural touchstone at the time. I mean, we generally had the sense for this is a person who also reads books and listens to music and such. And I can't remember the first conversation. I
remember texting Carter during 2020 during quarantine and being whoa, I'm rereading these books and they really hold up.
What's so wild is that they actually do hold up. If you go back and read them right now, there are maybe one or two things that I'm I would have said that differently, but there's nothing in them that makes me go, ooh, I wish that hadn't been said. It's just sort of sometimes the language has changed. I think there's a real surprise to that they're still so good.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like I already know the answer to this, but do you have a favorite book in the series?
Oh yeah, I can confidently answer this for both of us. We both love The Titan's Curse and we both love The House of Hades.
You spoiled The House of Hades, so did you still enjoy your experience despite knowing the answer to the book?
I was having personal struggles at the time because I was trying to sort out my feelings about Nico D'Angelo. I had very intense, strong feelings related to him. I don't know if they were romantic interest, but I didn't know if I wanted to be him. I remember having a really hard time as a kid being am I a child of Hades or am I not a child of Hades? Because if I say I'm a child of Hades, then I can't mentally date Nico D'Angelo. And that was a real, I would think about this for hours on end in the middle of the day. Is this my identity or is this what I'm interested in? romantically. Who knows?
Is that one of the first times or earlier times that you can remember thinking about like characters in a romantic way towards yourself? Like, I think that's such a part of development for kids to start recognizing like, oh, I like that character who's not real, but then start to apply that to your real life as well.
Yeah, maybe. I know that Nico was like probably the first gay character outside of Kurt Hummel, you know?
Oh my God. Yep. That we would have encountered and talked about. Yeah.
And like it's in a time before anybody was like using the word gay to like talk about themselves, you know? Like obviously our group of friends is like the flag, but like at the time, you know, that kind of language and like self-awareness was not even remotely in our vicinity yet, you know?
Right.
And so I think seeing that character was like a little bit of like, okay. There was like a shudder to a stop and be like, what, how am I supposed to feel about this? Like in relation to myself? Like, yeah, very strange.
Yeah, I think there's something special about that because people don't necessarily think about the fact that that's part of children's literature as well. Like you are starting to feel these feelings and think these thoughts and like having something to project that on in a pretty, you know, pure way. There's no level of like, no one's like, you know, having sex behind the cabin in these books. Like they're books for kids. So you have the chance to sort of like explore those feelings and thoughts in that pure is not the right word. I'm using the wrong word here, but in a innocent is the word I'm looking for, in a more innocent way.
Mm-hmm.
So you did start a Harry Potter book club when you were in middle school, high school?
Elementary school. I was over it by middle school.
You were done. Did you do something similar for Percy Jackson, or were these books that you guys really just shared with each other and the rest of your friend group?
We did create a few fan pages specifically for the extended John Green oeuvre. But I think at that point in time, there was a lot of content leaking out of Tumblr into other places for people who were like kind of extreme nerds. And that was, I think, probably, in addition to talking about the books, one of the primary ways in which we interfaced with other people and got thoughts about these things and celebrated them and saw a lot of gifs of Logan Lerman, you know, all of that.
So you're like on online fandom and that element of sort of interacting with other people.
We didn't have Tumblr accounts.
No?
Yeah, we weren't on Tumblr, actually. We weren't necessarily, like, our first foray into being a part of the, like, online Percy Jackson community was doing the podcast.
Mm.
We have a friend, shout out to our friends who host Monster Donut. Phoebe, who's one of the co-hosts of Monster Donut, like, is famous in the online, like, Percy Jackson Tumblr world because she's been on it since she was, like, in elementary or, like, in middle school.
Oh, wow.
And I don't remember what book it was it The Blood of Olympus? She, like, spoiled it. She, like, leaked The Blood of Olympus somehow. And this was like a whole big deal. I didn't know about this at the time because I wasn't really on Tumblr, but it was like she still has like a gigantic Tumblr following for Percy Jackson. She does like fan art and stuff. And she just recently started this podcast with her friend Emily. But that is like iconic, you know, like we were not there. Cannot claim that space or history.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too because I think maybe it's just that the age group of the time and when these books came out, but I've noticed that a lot of people in the Percy Jackson fandom are only starting to interact on the online portion of it as adults. Like there wasn't as much of that sort of fandom section as kids. And maybe that's just because the internet wasn't fully the internet yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, like Twitter didn't exist when I was in 5th grade.
That's the thing, is the medium is the message. I think that's like such a huge part of it, is that when we were coming up, it was a lot about Tumblr. And Tumblr obviously had its text components, but like the GIF is the primary unit of information on Tumblr. And how are you going to have a huge GIF-based economy for something that had two garbage, completely disavowed by the fandom movies? Like that was not going to compete with Harry Potter or Supernatural or Doctor Who or Sherlock or any of those other properties, right? Whereas now that Twitter is running the show and Twitter really like the like 80 character joke is like the primary unit of information. Perfect. Yeah. Any property that you can just have ideas about that can like immediately tap into somebody, like, you know, where you can like use 80 characters to like get into this deep reservoir of shared cultural information from which a joke can emerge and resonate is going to work. So that's like perfect for a series of books. It's honestly better that there aren't a bunch of just for them, because then you can use your imagination to like think through.
Sure. Yeah.
To like visualize how the joke works.
Yeah. Yeah, it was not a text-based for sure. I agree with that. Like very much Tumblr, which was the fandom centric place. And now even moving it into TikTok, like there's no fan edits that you can do for a book. Like it has to be the element of like someone making their own content and putting their own face on it instead of sort of like a perfectly manicured actor that can have that visual component for your joke. So yeah, I think maybe it's just a product of like it wasn't exactly right for the fandom locations at the time.
And also, like, I think this our age and just the fact that we both weren't necessarily chronically online in elementary school yet, you know, like really helped. Because I know that there was like an online community at the time, and I've like heard tale of things that happened, especially surrounding like Nico, like people like,
oh yeah,
there was that whole, Tumblr was all about depression and like accidentally glorifying mental illness, maybe not so accidentally. And so like, I think it was kind of nice that we didn't have to experience the like our fandom through the lens of like toxic online discourse as kids, because it was like a more pure experience.
I agree. It really has like shifted from what it used to be, but Tumblr at that time was very much like the glorification of sort of like depression and anxiety. And
it's not that isn't also on Twitter and TikTok, but I do feel like it was, much worse on Tumblr.
Do you guys think that like now that there's this sort of resurgence with the new book, there's going to be a level of kids reading the original books again and having that experience for a new generation, and they'll still hold up for those kids?
I genuinely don't know if it ever stopped. Like when I went to the book tour, there were like a lot of people our age. There were a lot of people a little bit older than us. I would say, like late millennials into Zoomers. But then there were all like a bunch of the audience was middle school, late elementary school looking kids and their parents. My like elementary school teacher aunt is still like, this is one of the main things that we talk about when we get lunch is it's like a lot of family information that we're all like sharing with each other. And then tacked on to the end, we get like a good 30 minutes about the newest updates in the Riordan verse so that she can be really like fresh and present for her students who are still like reading it.
Oh wow.
I think there's resurgences for adults, like, and like people our age who get back into the books. But I agree. I do think, Sun of the Star, as of us recording this, I get weekly NYT bestseller emails. This is the 17th week of The Sun of the Star being on the New York Times bestseller list.
Wow.
For kids, hardcover fiction books. I remember being in high school, at like a senior in high school at the time, where I had stopped reading the Percy Jackson books because Trials of Apollo had just started, and I was hanging out with like a kid who was in 6th grade at the time. We were having like dinner with our families, and he was showing me all his books, and he was like, "These are the Trials of Apollo books." I was like, "Whoa, what are those?" And he was like, "Yeah, they're amazing," and started explaining the plot to me. And I was like, "Wow, like, yeah, Rick is still in his bag." And, the fact that he's never stopped, he hasn't not published a book for a single year since The Lightning Thief.
Wow.
He's written at least one book every single year. Working. Yeah. So like, and yeah, that's wild. And he will continue to reign supreme probably for a very long time. But I do hope more like older people get into it.
Yeah. I know for me, I'm excited to go back, so to speak. Like I think I stopped after Heroes of Olympus, and then I read the newest one, the Nico book. But the excitement of being like, oh, Percy's going to college? Are you sure? Like, how exciting! Like, good for him. And I'm like ready to go back and read everything again and immerse myself back in that world.
Yeah.
Do you guys, I'll ask if you think that the Percy Jackson books sort of taught you anything about yourself. We've kind of touched on little parts of it, but either in when you were reading them as kids or now that you've gone and sort of done a retrospective back into the books, do you think they helped you learn anything about yourself or who you wanted to be?
Yeah, a lot.
Tons, I think. We talked about some of those lessons earlier. Building, changing, looking to non-traditional role models. I think that those things are all present. I do feel like we just finished our read along of The Sun and the Star, and I do feel like Nico D'Angelo as a character was like, that was an event that was like very meaningful. I don't know, like I could probably say, like I could give you like an individual essay about Annabeth, about Percy,
about like the limitations of wisdom. That I think is an important lesson I continue to learn.
Yeah, that was something that was so unique of watching Annabeth be like humbled sometimes. And like not because she wasn't good at what she did, but because there were but because there are limitations to wisdom, but because there's other ways of being strong and having power. And yeah.
These books often use the word hero, heroes of Olympus, or that each of these characters are heroes in some regard. They go on these massive quests, and there's this element of an individual. Like when you think of a hero, you think of an individual who saves the masses. I don't know that that's the lesson that the Percy Jackson books give, as you guys have talked about, this yielding, this need for support, need for a team. Do you think that Percy Jackson gives a different message or a specific message on what it takes to be a hero?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Yielding is the answer.
Yielding is huge. Like yielding is not just about anti-individualism, it's also about like anti-grind mentality, you know? Like there are other versions of the story that are about somebody who, you know, like works really hard and made something out of himself out of nothing. There's a version of the story that is about somebody who like did it on his own and tried to get somewhere. And that's just, I think that particularly because those myths about success and greatness are so integral to general American ideas about what it means to be somebody who has power and somebody who has done well, that the books stand out for their implicit and explicit repudiation of those stories. And that also, I don't know, I do feel like it's worth noting that if you were to pick a secondary trope for that, it would be the idea of like, I'm going to put together a crew and, you know, the crew is going to do it together. We are like a group of exceptional people, and we like therefore will like look out for each other. We deserve, like implicitly be like, we deserve things that other people don't deserve, and we're going to give each other things that we're not going to give other people. And that's like also not the message of the books. Like ends with this scene of Percy deciding that he's going to give up immortality so that he can request that certain people be treated fairly, and the people he's requesting be treated fairly are like literally not his friends. Like all of his friends are not covered by the terms that he lays out, and that it's like people who he has seen harmed and who like literally were fighting him along the way, but who for whom he has like developed a sense of empathy and understanding and a sense that like what they were going through wasn't fair. And I feel like that vision of heroism as being somebody who like does have to like work hard and accomplish tasks and develop skills that are unique has to go along with a sense of questioning and listening and community responsibility and like collectivism. I do feel like is a really different version of a hero, even if it is maybe possible for somebody to read these books and just be like, I think it's cool that a kid with like shaggy hair and a sword like fights a lot of monsters. I just don't feel like that's what people are walking away from it with.
I think of yielding specifically as far as Percy learning that he doesn't have the skills to accomplish everything himself. Like, and that especially in his relationship with Annabeth, he has to trust that not only is she going to be capable of doing something on her own, but that she's going to be safe doing it on her own, and that he has to let her do things on her own. Like that being a hero and being a leader is just as much stepping back and trusting other people can accomplish things as it is, you know, waving your sword around.
Yeah, I like a couple of things you guys talked about, but especially the idea of individualism and also learning empathy, because I think a lot of times in these chosen one narratives, that empathy part is often missing. There's like, as opposed to seeing unfair treatment and wanting to fix it and learning that along the way and being willing to sacrifice something for yourself, there's something also in the fact that he's sacrificing immortality, which is something that ultimately he doesn't need, he doesn't want. It's putting himself above other people as opposed to keeping himself in that human experience. And I think sometimes when I'm thinking of other, you know, paranormal books or books that were very popular at the time, like Twilight or The Hunger Games or these different things, Divergent I think was also pretty popular at the time. A lot of those are that individualist narrative of one person. Well, Twilight, no one's saving the world, but
Sure aren't.
But you know, whatever. Same thing. Falling in love, saving the world, totally the same thing. But I think like part of it, the reason I thought of it is the idea of immortality, which is Bella has the opportunity to become immortal in these books, and it's sort of her goal, versus Percy has this opportunity to become immortal, and it's what he's willing to give up to give fairness to the world. And I think there's something about the fact that like these books do a really good job of saying like one person shouldn't have too much power. Each time one person does have too much power or becomes too close to too much power, that's where things start to go straight to hell, because you have Luke who gets a little bit too close to it. You've got this desire to be seen, and each of these kids in these books, every single one of those kids at Camp Half-Blood only has one parent, has not necessarily the best circumstances of growing up because of their sort of godly parents' neglect or godly parents in sometimes like expectations that are too out of control. And I think you find a lot of those kids, each one of them is reacting to that either by like hunting for power, hunting for glory, or in Percy's experience, finding a way to help others or to team up and understand that he can't do it on his own. And I think in the end of him sacrificing that power is partially because he's had the chance to see how much that power can cause problems.
Absolutely.
I think I would have been so sad to see him rise to the same level of the people who had been harming his friends for all this time and harming himself.
Oh, yeah. Percy is an understander of power and power systems being inherently flawed.
Yeah. Yeah. There's that. They say it in history class all the time, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so I, like you said, in these other books that would have been happening at the same time, the idea is for that character to become, to win the power, to win the immortality or the presidency. That's not the right term. I'm just trying to think of like the ultimate goal of getting that power back because they've been oppressed for so long. And this instead, you see someone recognizing, especially at such a young age, and for the people reading it at such a young age, recognizing that the power was the problem in the first place. So there's something quite wonderful about that.
The way that we get to see Percy continue to question that idea of his power throughout his career as a hero and a demigod, like that moment in The Last Olympian isn't the last time that we see him wrestle with the fact that he has so much physical power and that can easily become something very violent and scary, and that's not something he wants to ever do.
Yeah, and you start off as well with like the first entrance to the book being, if any of this sounds like it might be your life, like put the book down, you don't need to know about this. This is the worst possible option. Like
I didn't want to be a half-foot.
yeah, and I think I wonder if you guys think like him being claimed by this big three, for those who maybe need a refresher, the big three gods all agreed they weren't going to have kids anymore because they're too powerful. It's a sort of level of a curse, like it's too much for one person to have. So you actually start off with him being identified as someone who shouldn't exist.
And also being exhausted by the burden of his life before anything has even happened. That's what makes these books so timeless and relatable and awesome, is that like it's not like you're waiting for your letter to Hogwarts. You are literally like, the whole Greek mythology, whatever, is just a metaphor for how difficult life is and how endless problems and challenges and quests are you're constantly being bombarded with these things you didn't ask for. But how are you going to use this position to keep yourself safe and take care of other people as much as possible?
Yeah, for some reason, I remember rereading them and being like, he complains so much, but it didn't bother me. Like, I was like, yeah, you know what? This does suck. I'm so sorry for you. Like, you said you were going to summer camp. Turns out you're off to risk your life yet again. That's kind of a bummer. Well, this has been great. I've really loved kind of digging into these books with you guys and talking about how much they matter and how much they still last. And ultimately, it just became this wonderful discussion of how much we feel that these books are kind of timeless and valuable for kids, I think, or adults. I think if you pick them up right now, no matter how old you are, you will learn something about power and how it's used. Do you guys feel like you would have maintained your friendship as adults as much if you hadn't shared literature and fandom together?
I will say, like, I remember being really, really, really scared going to college because so much of my taste and identity was developed because of and like alongside Carter's in particular. And that has always been like something that we shared, and also just like something like I looked as like a litmus test of like, I kind of enjoyed this, but let me see if Carter liked it. and then I'll find out if it was actually really good and I was right. You know? And so that was like a really scary thing to like separate. And you know, like we went to different colleges and whatever. But like personally, we would not be anywhere near as close as we are now if we hadn't been doing the podcast specifically. 10 out of 10, if you like miss one of your best friends in the entire world, I would recommend roping them into doing a weekly podcast with you. Because now like Carter has to respond to my texts. It's wild.
Well, I'll let you guys get back to your best friendship and wrap up by asking you my last question that I ask everyone, which is, if you had never read the Percy Jackson books, what would be different about you today? I would say like separate from your job, you know what I mean? Like separate from your podcast. What about you as a person would be different today?
Oh my God, everything. That's like such an alternate dimension.
Yeah, I just watched both of you slip into like a totally different world for a moment.
I think everything would be so different, and I think my sense of self would be so different. But also, I think that my expectations of romantic relationships would be perhaps lower.
Real, yeah. The books are so expansive and so to your core that it's difficult to answer this question. Like, there's some properties where I'd be like, oh, I would not like know about this thing, or I would not, be as in touch with this part of my identity. But I feel like this is core level. This is like, it's like, it would be like in the nuances of like what you expect from other people and like what you think you owe to other people and like what is a good way to like these like core questions about like
a primary lens through which I experience my entire life.
Yes.
Yeah, it sounds like I think I've listened to both of you talk a lot about the values that these have imparted on you. Not only like what you expect from other people and what you think like the world deserves, but also I like that a couple of times you both have said like what you owe to other people as a person and that fundamental exchange of humanity. And I think that's really powerful that you feel from these books about, someone could very sillily say, like, as you said earlier, a shaggy haired kid with a sword that turns into a pen. Like, but it does really sound like fundamentally your value system from these books has imprinted on you.
Yeah, we should cite that like What We Owe to Each Other is like a book by T.M. Scanlon that is like one of the like considered one of the like great foundational works of like 20th century like ethics, but also independent of that like work of kind of dense philosophy. Percy Jackson. That's what it's really about.
Would I have had a framework to read Camus if I didn't read Percy Jackson when I was 9? What came first in my life, What impacted me when my brain was the squishiest?
What is more foundational? Yeah.
I think that's beautiful. You know what? I think like a lot of children's literature just does not get the credit it deserves because you're right. Your brain is the squishiest. It's the most available to be impacted.
And the experience of talking to children's authors through this podcast, there's not a single children's author or like author who writes books for young kids out there who writes thinking that they're writing for children, because those authors know that children are people, and that there's nothing you have to dumb down or do anything differently in order to tell the story.
Yeah, I agree. I think Percy Jackson specifically doesn't dumb it down. And maybe that's part of that expectation of why it's so great now, even if you read it again. It holds up because it respects children as people, as you're saying. So, well, I'm glad that our entire generation had something as foundational and just good at its core for us to experience and sort of create our moral values and compass out of. So thank you, Rick.
Yeah. Percy's literally Gen Z president.
So true. Well, thank you guys for both coming on. I had so much fun with this conversation. I appreciate you for breaking ground with me on a 2-guest adventure and for sharing your friendship with me. This was really exciting. This is really fun. Well, that was beautiful. If you guys enjoyed this experience, you can listen to Carter and Erica every week on the Percy Jackson podcast, Seaweed Brain. If you're listening now and you're picking up the book on the 26th, you can join me next week with Mike Schubert to talk about the books as well.
Michael, Mr. Schubert.
Mr. Schubert returns to the podcast. So get excited. All right. See you guys next week. Between now and next Wednesday, if you want to keep in touch, you can follow me on social media at Marissa Kumari, anywhere you get your social media fix. You can also sign up for my newsletter by going to our website, tandonproductions.com, clicking on You Are What You Love, and signing up there. I send out an issue with every episode of this podcast. And we just started a Discord server, so if you want to connect with me, with other listeners, and talk about the types of things that we are talking about on this show, you can join that by clicking on the link in the episode description. Until next Wednesday, I hope you are enjoying what you love.